Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is My New York. Today, class, we tackle the subject of DNA. Wait, don't touch the dial. I would not dare bore you with a class in biology. No, the DNA that I'm talking about is a lively website that reports on everything from mayhem to chocolate mousse. DNAinfo, it's called. Among its stellar staff is Murray Weiss, award-winning veteran of the Daily News and the Post, and now criminal justice editor of DNAinfo. You will meet him next. Happy to welcome Murray Weiss to our program. What I told the audience a little bit about DNAinfo. What is it, and how did it come about?
Well, it was the idea of a gentleman named Joe Ricketts, actually. He thought that the world of newspapering was ignoring local news in urban environments in particular. So he thought that the web would be a brilliant place to reintroduce local news to readers. And he created a website in Manhattan that covered only Manhattan news, and it was a really great success. He expanded through the whole city. Mm-hmm. So there's a DNAinfo here in New York. There's a DNAinfo in Chicago. That's a great success too. And all we cover really is the city of New York. Pretty much fundamentally, that's it. Locally, we have reporters based around the city doing neighborhood news. You want to know what's going on in Williamsburg or Bedford-Stuyvesant or Bushwick or out in Queens and different pockets in New York City. I, of course, cover the whole city and write about anything citywide.
How did you get there? I mean, you're a veteran of the tabloids, the Daily News, police reporter, the Post. You were the criminal justice editor. So much of your life in newspapers, and now this.
Well, actually, it's a funny thing. It's people think that the newspaper industry, of course, is shrinking and that the future is the digital news world, and they're correct. And I was asked to write for them, like once a week, a column when I left the Post to take a break. And I started writing there once a week, and I liked it. And then I started writing. Yes, for DNA. Then I actually started winning some journalism awards for them, and they asked me to stay on, and I've stayed ever since. I had opportunities to go back to the newspaper world, and having had like an extensive background in the newspaper business and being on the front pages, to move to the digital format where there's no tactile, you don't see a picture in the paper anymore, it was a great shift. But people think I was really, forward-thinking and really smart, but the reality is it really was more by accident than by design.
What do you find you get reactions similar to what you used to get to your stories in the paper from what you put online now? How is it different?
It's different, and it's different on many, many levels. From the reaction side, you write newspaper stories and you get on the subway and you can see people reading them. Right. And maybe somebody will write you a letter in the old days, and you get a letter saying, hey, I hate you or I like you or whatever.
Murray Kempton was famous, the great columnist, was famous for saying that he revered newspapers, among other reasons, because somebody would read it on the subway, maybe leave it behind, and some young person might pick it up and learn something. Mm-hmm.
That's very true. That's very true, but we're in a different world. The difference now is I publish something on the web, a story of mine, and in a nanosecond, people are on it, reading it. You can calculate how many, you can see how many. It gets passed around instantly by any untold numbers of people. So the newspaper business, which was like wonderful, I mean, the whole sense of the production of the paper, right, and that people had it, passed it around, but you never really knew how many. You knew that the Post was printing 500,000 papers. When I worked at the Daily News, they printed 1.5 million. So if you were on the front page, you knew 1.5 million people were seeing it, which is fantastic. And I wish the newspapers were still doing that, quite honestly. But in the world of digital, everything moves so quickly and instantly and broadly. And the response speaking of the response, you get that too. You get the feedback instantly. If you have a good story, you instantly see it stolen by the newspapers and put on their websites or HuffPo. So it's a very different dynamic, but it's a very powerful one, and it's clear to me that's why it's the future of the delivery of news.
You majored in philosophy.
Correct.
How does somebody who majored in philosophy wind up in journalism?
Well, I'll tell you the funny story of that. There's a funny aspect to it. My dad, God bless him, he was a great generation guy, the great American generation. Served in the Second World War, was a flyer. He had a brother who was also a flyer in the South Pacific. My dad flew in Europe, and his brother didn't return. He got into he was in the delivery guy for the New York Daily News, and his father delivered newspapers, was a driver for the Sun. So the newspapers used to arrive in my house all the time. And by the time I got into college, I wanted to become like a writer, and I wanted to get out and meet lots of people and have an interesting sort of career, And my dad sat down at the kitchen table with me one day, and it was one of those, what are you going to do with your life, Murray?
Do something that...
Yeah.
Have a fallback.
Yeah, so I said to him, he said, what are you studying in school, Murray? I was a senior. And I said, well, I'm studying philosophy, Dad. And he looks at me and he goes, last time I looked in the Help Wanted ads, I didn't see too many ads for philosophers wanted. So I didn't tell him that privately I really wanted to write, and that was around the time of Watergate, by the time I got out of college, and Woodward and Bernstein were changing the world, and I thought this would be an exciting arena to get into.
And philosophy was because you had to show something at home, like that you were going to make something of yourself.
I thought it was, I really, we lived through a turbulent time then, so it was easy to become analytical and wonder what the world really is and how it operates. I used to joke years later when I became the police bureau chief of the Daily News, there were 2,000 murders, and a copy editor there who taught at Columbia brought some students in. And they were all, of course, well, what did you study in college? And I said, I studied philosophy. And I said, I used to discuss death. Now I cover it. So,
well, let's talk about what you cover and the issues that comprise your sweet spot. Especially right now, the terrorism talk is in the air, the threats of terrorism after Paris. And I was interested that Police Commissioner Bratton, after Paris, created a new response team. You describe what he did there.
Well, very simply, the concept is, and I think the world can recognize why. These active shooter situations, you need a unit of police personnel who are highly trained, highly skilled, and I must say highly heroic, to be equipped and have the skill level to rush into these situations and quickly figure out what to do to minimize and defeat the threat that's going on in a moment's time. So the evolution of terrorism here in New York and fighting it, has evolved to this point where I think he correctly identified he needs a little military force inside a military force that'll take this on. Like in Paris, you need trained officers. You can't just have an officer on the beat running into a situation, on some of these situations.
Well, we keep hearing from our officials, as I suppose citizens in other cities and other countries here, we're prepared, we're ready. And I tell you, my reaction to Bratton creating that special response team was, really? It took Paris to suggest to do this in 2015?
Yeah.
He didn't think of this after the World Trade Center? He didn't think of it, at other times? Are we really ready?
It's hard to, listen, I've covered law enforcement on all levels for a long, long time. They try to forward think. Are they always ahead of the curve? No. And to some degree, it's part of the problem is that there are huge organizations, so to try to change them and move them.
Well, we understand that the police department is at, 37,000 people. It's a bureaucracy. But if you're not ahead of the curve, that can be fatal. That can cost a lot of lives.
True. But I think that, honestly, I think they try to stay on top of and move in front of. And, as we all know, there are certain restrictions that they can't do. There's lots of debates now about surveillance and the whole post-Snowden stuff about having access to data, your telephone data, your cell phone data. So there are restrictions on law enforcement, too, and that ebbs and flows as well. They try to push the envelope forward, and then people push back that they're intruding on your privacy, that there are all kinds of, ancillary issues.
Well, another piece of it is the encryption. Now, even Apple, you have an Apple phone, even Apple can't get into your phone without the code. And law enforcement says, no, we need a back door. And the other side of the argument says, well, but at what cost? It's not like it's black and white. I mean, one side saying, we need the back door, and the other side saying, no, you can't have it. I mean, I think they both understand the complexity of the issue, but how much do you see that impacting what's going on now? Something like encryption.
Oh, I've seen it. I've seen it impact through my entire career covering law enforcement, that it ebbs and flows. There are periods where law enforcement goes too far, and there are committees that, rein them in, and then the pendulum swings too far the other way. And then there's terrorist events. People forget in the early 80s and late 70s, there were bombings in New York almost routinely. There were 100 bombings practically in a year or two period here. Different kinds of terrorism. But at that time, the FBI and the New York City Police Department were very restrained in stuff they could do, because in the 70s, for example, there were committee hearings that were reining in the intelligence community because they were getting involved in assassinations in foreign countries. And we were like, what? So they had the Church Committee is what it was called, and they reined this in. Then in the late 70s, early 80s, the law enforcement people were hampered in catching local terrorists. Then the pendulum swung again. Then 9/11 comes, and you can see, the United States government gets very aggressive, and the pendulum swings too far again. And we're in a period now where they're reining it in again. And sometimes, it's very good to rein in law enforcement because their tendency is to want to be a little intrusive. And you have to be careful about government has to be careful about how far it goes. And this is a free country, and everybody's entitled to privacy. And that's a delicate balance and ecosystem. And we're going through that period now where the terrorists are using the encrypted sites, and you'll see that there's going to be some shifting on that now.
Also related to terrorism, a story I saw recently that bothered me and also raised the question of just how ready are we? What kind of shape are we? The EMT was complaining that their radios still don't work underground. I mean, I find that incredible.
Yeah. After
all we've been through. What's your take on that? I mean, if EMTs can't communicate with each other in the subway.
I don't want to, I hate saying I've been around a long time, but I've been around a long time. I remember when that was an issue when I was a very young reporter at the Daily News. The subways had no radio communication for the transit police, who were, constantly carping about that. Then you fast forward almost 20 years. And on 9/11, there were discussions about the lack of communication amongst the fire people on 9/11 at the towers, amongst themselves. When the towers collapsed, of course, there was tremendous communication issues. And while they're building out an infrastructure in the subways, the bottom line is, for me, I think it's a horror. I mean, why the government hasn't found a way to improve or set up a system. The old Saturday Night Live joke with the conductor talks over the microphone to the audience, says, a train, and the guy actually talks like that.
Right.
They had a guy that actually talked that way. But, the improvements should have been done a long time ago.
You say a horror, and at least because here we are so many years later, as you point out. And it just raises for me the question of, I understand government officials wanting to essentially tell the populace, don't worry, we got your back. But they don't have our back, or at least there are indications that, there are holes in their coverage of us. And
There is. There's no getting around it. But I think they're doing as good a job as they can. I think a lot of the issues that you're discussing, the communication issues, involve money. You need government leaders who aren't necessarily law enforcement, who recognize the money that needs to get spent on these sorts of things. They have to prioritize these things, and until there's a problem, they don't. And that's the sad reality.
Let's talk about government a little bit here in the city. The mayor, de Blasio, he seems to have a tumultuous relationship with the police. Is that affecting our safety? Is that affecting how this city is policed and governed?
A little bit at the margin, I would say. I think the crime statistics are still very good in this city. I think there's a tremendously fractured relationship between the New York City police and the mayor. I think, even though I work for an organization called DNAinfo, I think police is not part of his DNA. His history, his philosophy, his approach to things, the things that are paramount to him are not in the law enforcement community, I think, by nature. And I think that has created problems from the outset with him.
You said crime statistics continue to be good, and let me play devil's advocate again. Can we believe, how much can we believe the crime statistic? There was a story not long ago of another cop, or ex-cop, I guess, who, when he was a cop, reported up the chain that, this was during Ray Kelly, that the CompStat, the statistics were cooked, the books were cooked, at least where he worked.
Right.
And he was basically manhandled, he was ill-treated then after that by the organization, and he sued. And recently got a nice fat settlement because he won. So here's a cop who says, the books are cooked. I tried to tell you. Nobody wanted to hear it, and they ostracized me. And by the way, now you're paying me off. How much should we believe the crime statistics?
Oh, I think you can believe honestly, you can believe most of the crime statistics. There was a period where there was untold pressure on commanders and the police to keep crime down. And as a result, there were certain categories of crimes that were pushed down to lower levels. Things, some thefts, maybe even some assaults were reduced. So I will concede that to a certain level, some minor crimes, or the relatively minor ones, were being massaged or fudged or pushed down. That kind of pressure that starts at the top of the police department, it filters its way down. It finds its way down to the streets, no doubt about it. But, the number of murders, these are numbers that can't be hidden. When you look at them, robberies, you look at those numbers compared to what they were. Even if you want to disbelieve a percentage of it, you have 300 and some odd murders by comparison to 2,200. I mean, the level of violence and crime in New York is completely changed.
We recently got a look at former Commissioner Ray Kelly's schedules, and they revealed a number of interesting things about his emphasis on stop and frisk. What struck you the most about when you saw those, when this came out?
Well, I actually was one of the first reporters to really do what I thought was some very important stories about the stop and frisk. And what I showed was the stop and frisk numbers were escalating. There were about 100,000 when Bloomberg came in. And at the height of Kelly's years, it reached like 700,000. I mean, that's like 700,000 compared to 100,000.
And the vast majority of these folks being stopped and frisked were men of color, or people of color.
Correct.
In this city.
So, but the number of shootings was constant. The crime levels were like this. So you have all this stopping and frisking, and when you finally did an analysis of it, it's like, why? And how do you get that many stop and frisks from a finite force? So they're like stopping and frisking more and more people. How?
I think you wrote it in one of your stories that your analysis showed it wasn't really taking guns off the street.
Correct. That the seizures of guns and the level of gun shootings remained a constant through the Bloomberg administration. So what effect was all this having? What it's having is that you're basically stopping hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers every year, like 500,000, 600,000.
Well, the effect it seemed to have is it created a huge gulf between the minority community
Correct.
and the police.
Correct.
I mean,
correct.
they're worlds apart. At least
Correct.
that.
Correct. Now, the schedules he put out were very interesting because it showed this nightlife he had, that the police commissioner had, that Ray Kelly had. And I think it's part of the same picture, you know.
Nightlife in what sense?
Well, he was a busy guy at night. You know, he went to all these, A-list events like crazy. So, he was like a prince of the city, really, a king of the city.
Bratton doesn't do that?
Bratton likes the limelight, too. There's no getting around it. But Ray Kelly actually, I think, outdistances him on that. So you have low crime. Ray Kelly was the face of crime fighting in New York. He was the only person who spoke at press conferences. He was the guy saving New York from crime. He's the guy out at night as the face of, with all the rich people.
Well, you and I, let's be honest here with our audience, or at least be candid. We saw him many a night, you and I and others at Elaine's when Elaine's
he would
was...
go. I had a book party there. He came, and he actually stayed a long, long time. But, but he enjoys that. He enjoys that. And, what I'm suggesting here, without saying it, is that, the need to keep crime down becomes a personal issue for the police commissioner, and particularly for him, because he was such the face of it. And I think that contributed to a little strong ego, got a very strong ego that's getting reinforced at night at these parties, and he's doing the press conferences. And he needs to keep crime down. And when you get the ego to the desire to keep crime down, you put your foot to the pedal harder. And that's how the stop and frisk numbers begin to climb.
Yeah, you get 700,000 stop and frisk.
Yeah, I would say that was the flaw in all this.
You have said that a highlight, or maybe the highlight of your career, was writing a book about John O'Neill of the FBI. Tell us briefly who John O'Neill was and what he meant to this city.
Well, and to this country in many ways. John O'Neill was from 1995 right up to virtually 9/11, was the National Security Director for the FBI. And in that position, he was in charge of all the counterterrorism initiatives and investigations for the FBI here and around the world. So in the late 90s, he investigated the Khobar Towers. He investigated the Twin Embassy bombings. And to their credit, to give a picture of how enormous that is, taking a crime scene from Africa and putting it in a Manhattan federal courthouse and convicting terrorists is a Herculean concept. He investigated the USS Cole. So he was at the tip of the spear of everything that was going on in terrorism in the world for the FBI, and in effect for the United States of America. And he was a forward-thinking proponent of the great threat to the United States was the Islamic radical. And he chased bin Laden, but he said that the whole Islamic radical threat was the greatest threat to the United States of America. And he tried getting everybody to recognize it.
They weren't listening when he was talking.
No. He had about, 100 agents and detectives that were doing all this work. And he was not your cookie-cutter FBI guy. He had a very complicated personal life. He had a lot of women in it. But he was an amazing leader and very creative and forward-thinking. But he got squeezed out of the Bureau. And he took a job as the director of security at the World Trade Center, which he knew more than anybody was the number one target. And he knew that it was going to be hit, and it was hit, and he died on 9/11 in the towers. And his loss actually was an enormous loss to this country because after 9/11, he would have served a very, very, very pivotal role in the post-9/11 configuration of how to deal with the threats to the United States.
We'd be remiss if we didn't have you mention the name of this book.
Oh, Thank you. The Man Who Warned America.
Subtitle, and America didn't listen.
Yeah, well, it was just, the embattled FBI, national security leader, who you correctly point out, was ultimately not listened to. Yeah.
I want to jump completely off the track here. I read something about you that startled me and fascinated me. You spent 6 weeks traveling with the Who.
Yes.
What was that?
What was that? That was really pretty cool. I lived with somebody who was the U.S. manager for the Who.
Okay.
So I got a invite to travel, in their private plane and go to all the concerts. And I was a big Who fan, as most people are.
When was this?
1989. I flew all around America with them, into Canada, and must have seen, 25, 30 Who shows right on the stage. I'm standing right on the stage.
Did you
was
write
quite an
about
experience.
it? Did you?
No.
No, you can't. No. That was part of the deal. You can't.
No. I could have, but I didn't. I would have liked to. I would have done it as from a childhood remembrance sort of thing. Because when I was younger, I tried getting to see the Who with a friend of mine, and the concert was canceled. And here I was all these years later, actually with them. It was pretty remarkable, actually.
It's good to see you, Murray Weiss.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. I appreciate it.
Thank you for coming. And we thank you. We will see you next week.